The Celestial Concorde was a massive, gleaming space station floating in the heart of neutral space. It was the chosen meeting place for some of the galaxy's most powerful factions, a symbol of diplomacy and fragile peace. Today, it hosted a historic event, the first direct negotiations between the Seraphon Dominion and the United Human Federation. Inside the Grand Hall, the air was thick with tension. Tall Seraphon diplomats, draped in elegant silver robes, stood in quiet formation. Their smooth, pale blue skin and glowing violet eyes gave them an ethereal presence. The Seraphon were an ancient race, known for their intelligence, discipline, and emotional control. To them, emotions were distractions, unnecessary burdens that clouded judgment. At the center of the Seraphon delegation stood Princess Varelia, heir to the Dominion. She was the perfect example of her people's ideals, calm, composed, and utterly unreadable. Her long silver hair was tied back in intricate braids, and her expression was as cold as the void itself. She had spent decades mastering the art of diplomacy, ensuring that nothing could shake her composure. That was, until he arrived. The massive doors slid open with a soft hiss, and in walked the human delegation. Leading them was Captain Elias Ward, a decorated soldier representing humanity's military strength. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair slightly unkempt, and his sharp brown eyes filled with quiet confidence. Unlike the Seraphon, who moved with grace and silence, Elias walked with a casual, almost reckless energy, as if the weight of diplomacy didn't faze him. Varelia's gaze met his the moment he stepped forward. It was supposed to be an ordinary glance, a simple assessment of the man before her. Yet, something strange happened. For the first time in her life, her heart skipped a beat. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible, but she felt it. A tiny shift in her normally perfect rhythm. It was ridiculous. There was no logical reason for such a reaction. And yet there it was. Elias approached the negotiation table, giving a polite nod. "Princess Varelia," he said smoothly. His voice was deep, steady, and strangely warm. She returned the nod, keeping her tone neutral. "Captain Ward, humanity's reputation precedes you." He smirked. "I hope it's a good one." The corner of her lips almost twitched. Almost. The negotiations began, with both sides presenting their terms. The Seraphon valued order and tradition, while humanity thrived on adaptability and ambition. The talks were slow and careful, each word chosen with precision. Yet, throughout the entire discussion, Varelia found herself oddly distracted. It was Elias. Unlike the other human diplomats, who spoke with careful diplomacy, he was unorthodox. He didn't hesitate to challenge statements, ask direct questions, or throw in the occasional dry remark. His confidence was different from the measured pride of the Seraphon. It was unpredictable, almost reckless. And it was unsettling. No one spoke to her like this. No one looked at her like this. Seraphon males were raised to be reserved, to see her as royalty first and a person second. But Elias, he held her gaze without hesitation. There was no fear, no nervousness, only an intense curiosity, as if he were studying her just as much as she was studying him. And that made her uncomfortable. The meeting lasted for hours, and by the time the first session ended, Varelia needed a moment to herself. She stepped onto one of the station's observation decks, staring out into the endless sea of stars. The vastness of space usually brought her clarity, but today her thoughts were tangled. The sound of footsteps made her tense, but she quickly masked it. She turned to see Elias standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching her with that same unreadable expression. "You're not easy to read, Princess," he said, his tone light but probing. She raised an eyebrow. "Is that a problem?" "Not at all." He leaned against the railing, gazing at the stars. "Just not what I expected." She studied him carefully. "And what did you expect?" He shrugged. "Cold, distant, untouchable. But now, I'm not so sure." A flicker of something unfamiliar stirred within her chest. She did not know whether it was annoyance or intrigue. She straightened. "You assume too much, Captain Ward. And you hide too much, Princess Varelia." His smirk returned. "But I suppose that's the Seraphim way." She should have been irritated. Instead, she felt something entirely different, something that made her pulse quicken again. For the first time in her life, the ever-composed Princess Varelia felt flustered, and she did not know why. The next day, the negotiations resumed in the grand hall of the Celestial Concord. The air was filled with quiet tension, a battle of patience and diplomacy between the two factions. The Seraphim Dominion, disciplined and controlled, believed in careful words and calculated decisions. The United Human Federation, bold and unpredictable, preferred directness and quick action. At the center of it all stood Princess Varelia and Captain Elias Ward. Varelia had spent the entire night meditating, trying to understand what had happened to her the previous day. She was not supposed to feel anything, especially not towards a human soldier who did not even carry himself like a proper diplomat. Yet something about Elias unsettled her, something beyond his words. As the discussions began, she steeled herself, determined not to let him distract her again. Elias, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease. He leaned forward, hands resting on the polished negotiation table, his brown eyes sharp yet relaxed. "Let's talk about the security arrangements," he said, cutting straight to the point. "The Federation is willing to share patrol routes in the outer sectors, but we expect the Seraphim to contribute forces." One of the Seraphim advisors, Chancellor Zaris, frowned. "We do not involve ourselves in unnecessary conflicts." Elias smirked. "Pirates don't care about your policies, Chancellor. If your ships don't help, your trade routes will stay vulnerable." Varelia remained calm. "The Dominion does not act on impulse. We require certainty before making commitments." Elias leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. "Sometimes, Princess, waiting too long is the risk." Her fingers twitched. He was doing it again, challenging her, forcing her to engage in a way she wasn't used to. Still, she did not falter. "Caution is not weakness, Captain. It is wisdom." Elias grinned, "And wisdom without action is just hesitation." A murmur passed through both delegations. Few ever spoke so boldly to a Seraphim royal, yet Elias did so without hesitation. For the first time, Varelia felt an odd sense of enjoyment. He was not like the usual diplomats, always careful, always predictable. He was direct, unafraid, and irritatingly interesting. She met his gaze, and action without wisdom is recklessness. His grin widened. "Good thing we humans are good at both." For the briefest moment, something flickered in her chest. Amusement. She buried it instantly. The negotiations continued, and while progress was slow, something else was happening. A battle of wits between Elias and Varelia. Each time he made a bold statement, she countered it with cold logic. Each time she tried to outmaneuver him with diplomacy, he responded with sharp improvisation. It became less of a formal discussion and more of an unspoken game, one neither of them acknowledged but both were fully aware of. Hours passed, and finally, the first stage of negotiations concluded. A short recess was announced, allowing both sides to rest before the next round. As the delegates dispersed, Elias approached Varelia, hands casually in his pockets. "You enjoy this, don't you?" She raised an eyebrow. "Negotiating peace is a responsibility, not enjoyment." He smirked. "I wasn't talking about the treaty." Her posture remained flawless, but something about his words made her throat tighten slightly. She tilted her chin. "You assume too much, Captain. And you hide too much, Princess." His voice was smooth, confident, "But I'll figure you out eventually." For the first time in years, Varelia did not have an immediate response. Before she could find one, Elias turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, heart beating faster than it should. Something was happening, something she did not understand. And for the first time in her life, That unsettled her. The negotiations had reached a difficult point. The Seraphon Dominion and the United Human Federation could not agree on military cooperation. The Seraphon, cautious and methodical, hesitated to commit forces without absolute certainty. The humans, bold and action-driven, saw hesitation as a weakness. To break the deadlock, Captain Elias Ward made an unexpected suggestion: a joint military exercise on the jungle world of Vecris. Princess Varelia had been skeptical at first, but she knew that the Dominion respected strength. A demonstration of humanity's military capability could prove their value as allies. And so she agreed. Now, standing on the surface of Vecris, she wondered if that had been a mistake. The planet was humid, covered in thick forests and rocky cliffs. The sky was a deep shade of violet, with two suns casting a strange glow over the land. Small rivers carved paths through the terrain, making navigation difficult. On one side of the jungle stood the Seraphon warriors, clad in sleek silver armor, their weapons humming with energy. They moved in perfect formation, precise and disciplined. On the other side, the human soldiers, dressed in rugged combat gear, checked their weapons and gear with a mix of casual chatter and quiet focus. Unlike the Seraphon, they were not rigid. They were relaxed but alert, confident but unpredictable. At the center of it all, Elias and Varelia faced each other, the leaders of their respective forces. Elias smirked. "Ready to see how we fight, Princess." Varelia's expression remained cool. The Dominion does not rely on unnecessary displays. We believe in results. Elias chuckled. "Good, because we're about to give you some." With a sharp signal, the exercise began. The Seraphon's precision versus humanity's chaos. The Seraphon warriors moved like a well-oiled machine. Their tactics were flawless, their coordination near perfect. Every step, every attack was calculated. They advanced in formation, covering each other's blind spots, moving as one. The humans, however, were something else entirely. They did not follow rigid formations. Instead, they adapted on the fly, breaking apart into small, flexible teams. They moved fast, using the terrain to their advantage, setting up ambushes, laying traps, and improvising. Elias led from the front, darting through the trees with an almost reckless confidence. He used everything around him, covering fire, distractions, surprise maneuvers. His team was not the strongest, but they were the most unpredictable. Varelia observed closely, standing on a rocky ledge with a clear view of the battlefield. Her warriors were performing well, but something felt wrong. The humans should not have been holding their ground so easily against superior tactics. Then she saw it. The humans were not playing by the rules. Where Seraphon's strategy was elegant and logical, the humans bent the rules of combat. Instead of countering formations head-on, they disrupted them. Instead of reacting to attacks, they anticipated them. It was messy, it was chaotic, and yet, somehow, it worked. For the first time, Varelia felt uncertain, face to face on the battlefield. She could not remain an observer any longer. Activating her energy blade, she leaped from the ledge, landing smoothly in the thick of battle. The Seraphon soldiers immediately adjusted their formation, moving to protect her, but she raised a hand. "I will handle this." She moved with the elegance of a dancer, her blade cutting through the air with precision. She was fast, controlled, and deadly. The human soldiers quickly fell back, recognizing her as a dangerous opponent. Then Elias appeared. Blaster in hand, he dodged her first strike with a grin. "Didn't think you'd get your hands dirty, Princess." She narrowed her eyes. "I do what is necessary." Elias holstered his blaster, pulling out a combat knife instead. "Good. Let's see how you handle a real fight." He lunged. What followed was unlike anything Varelia had ever experienced. Elias did not fight like the Seraphon. He did not follow predictable movements or careful strategies. He fought with instinct, speed, and raw determination. He moved before she could predict, adapted before she could react. Their blades clashed, sparks flying in the air. Each attack was met with a counter, each strike dodged by a hair's breadth. Varelia was fast, but Elias was unpredictable. For the first time in her life, she felt challenged, and for some reason, she liked it. A moment of disruption. Then it happened. A loud explosion echoed through the jungle. The ground trembled. Both combatants froze. This wasn't part of the exercise, Elias muttered. A moment later, a Seraphim soldier ran up. Princess. Unknown forces detected. Real hostiles. Varelia's expression hardened. Pirates. They must have been watching the exercise, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Elias sighed. Well, looks like our little game just turned into the real thing. Varelia tightened her grip on her weapon. We will fight together. Elias gave her a sideways glance and grinned. Now that's the kind of teamwork I like. As the enemy forces closed in, Varelia prepared for battle. And for the first time, she realized something strange. She trusted him. The jungle of Vigris was no longer a training ground. It had turned into a battlefield. The explosion had shattered the controlled atmosphere of the military exercise. Now, real enemies, pirates, mercenaries, and unknown hostiles were emerging from the dense foliage, weapons blazing. Their armor was mismatched, their attacks wild and uncoordinated, but there were many of them. Captain Elias Ward quickly assessed the situation. His instincts screamed ambush. The enemy had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike, using the mock battle as a distraction. By his side, Princess Varelia stood tall, her glowing energy blade in hand, her silver eyes burning with cold determination. She was no longer just a diplomat. She was a warrior. And now, they had no choice but to fight together. The battle begins. Form up, Elias shouted to his soldiers, quickly taking command. The human troops immediately adjusted, falling into defensive positions, using the environment for cover. Varelia turned to her Seraphim warriors. Hold the line. Do not let them break through. The difference in their commands was clear. The Seraphim relied on discipline and structure. They formed a defensive wall, shields raised, weapons charged. The humans, on the other hand, spread out, using movement and improvisation, taking cover behind trees and boulders while returning fire. Despite their differences, both sides fought as one. Blaster fire lit up the jungle, explosions rocked the ground, and a clash of steel rang through the air. The enemy came in waves, relentless and brutal. They did not fight with honor or strategy. They fought for greed and blood. Elias was everywhere at once, moving swiftly through the battlefield, taking down enemies with quick precision. His combat knife flashed as he struck down a pirate who had gotten too close. He dodged a blaster shot, fired back, then turned to see Varelia. She moved like a shadow, her energy blade cutting through enemies with perfect, controlled strikes. She did not waste movements. Every attack was precise, every dodge calculated. There was no hesitation in her, only cold efficiency. Yet, despite her skill, the Seraphim were not used to chaos. Their formation was strong but rigid. The enemy exploited their lack of adaptability, flanking them, forcing them into close combat situations they were not trained for. Elias saw it instantly. Princess, your men need to spread out. Varelia hesitated for only a second. The Seraphim always fought in perfect unity, but now she saw the flaw in it. Trusting Elias's judgment, she gave the order. Break formation. Adapt to their attacks. Her warriors hesitated, but they obeyed. And for the first time, the Seraphim fought like humans, moving independently, adjusting on the fly, countering the enemy's unpredictable assaults. And it worked. The turning point. The battle raged on, but the tide began to turn. Elias and Varelia fought back to back, covering each other without even thinking. His gun, her blade. His instincts, her precision. His chaos, her control. A pirate rushed forward, aiming for Varelia's blind spot. Elias reacted instantly, grabbing her wrist and spinning her out of harm's way, blasting the enemy in one smooth motion. She looked at him, momentarily stunned. "You. No time for thanks, princess." He grinned. "We're not done yet." She exhaled sharply but gave a small nod. She had never fought alongside someone like this before, and she had never trusted someone like this before. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the battlefield. A pirate dropship had landed nearby, unloading reinforcements. Elias's smirk faded. "That's not good." Varelia narrowed her eyes. "Then we destroy it." Elias grinned. "Now you're speaking my language." The final push. The enemy had made a mistake. Instead of keeping their ship airborne, they had landed, which meant it could now be taken out. Elias and Varelia led the charge, cutting through the last of the foot soldiers as they pushed toward the enemy vessel. The pirates, realizing the danger, turned all their firepower on them. Elias tackled Varelia behind cover just as a barrage of blaster fire tore through the air. "We need a plan before we get fried." Varelia's mind worked quickly. "The power core. If we overload it, the ship will be destroyed." Elias smirked. "I like the way you think." Using a combination of Seraphon precision strikes and human sabotage tactics, they fought their way inside the dropship. Elias took out the engineers while Varelia hacked into the control systems, setting the reactor to overload. A loud alarm blared through the ship. "Time to go." Elias grabbed her hand, pulling her away just as the core began to explode. They barely made it out before the ship went up in flames, the shockwave knocking them both off their feet. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, cheers erupted from both Seraphon and human forces. The enemy had been defeated. A moment of realization. Elias sat up, groaning. Well, that was fun. Varelia, still catching her breath, turned to look at him. For the first time, she did not see him as just a human soldier. She saw him as an equal, as someone she could rely on. He met her gaze, and for a moment, everything else faded. The battlefield, the soldiers, the war. Just the two of them, breathing heavily, adrenaline still rushing through their veins. Elias gave a tired but amused smile. "Admit it, princess. You enjoyed that." Varelia opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Because, to her own surprise, she did. The jungle of Vikris was finally silent. The battle was over, and the enemy had been defeated. The remains of the pirate dropship still burned in the distance, sending dark smoke into the violet sky. The combined forces of humans and Seraphon stood together, victorious but exhausted. Captain Elias Ward rolled his shoulders, trying to ignore the soreness in his muscles. Well, that was a nice little workout. Beside him, Princess Varelia surveyed the battlefield with a calm but unreadable expression. Her silver eyes scanned her warriors, checking for casualties. Thankfully, losses had been minimal. She turned to Elias. "Your soldiers fought well." Elias smirked. "So did yours, once they stopped fighting like statues." Varelia exhaled sharply, a sound that might have been a laugh, if it were anyone else. "We were not prepared for an ambush, but your adaptability proved effective." Elias crossed his arms. "Are you saying you actually respect how we fight?" Varelia hesitated. She was not used to admitting such things, but after today, she could not deny it. "Yes," she said simply. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Wow, didn't expect that." She tilted her head slightly. "I do not lie." Elias chuckled. "I'll keep that in mind." For a moment, neither spoke. The battlefield still smelled of smoke and energy burns, but the tension between them was different now. They had fought together, trusted each other, and something had changed. An unexpected question. As the soldiers began clearing the battlefield, a message arrived from the command ships above. The Dominion and the Federation had been monitoring the battle, and now that the pirates were defeated, They were sending retrieval teams. It was almost time to leave. Varelia turned to walk away, but Elias called after her. "Wait," she stopped, glancing back. "What is it?" Elias hesitated, something uncharacteristically serious in his expression. "After we get back, what happens next?" She frowned slightly. "The negotiations will continue." This was merely an interruption. Elias studied her face. "That's not what I meant." Varelia felt something in her chest tighten. She knew what he was asking. What happened to them after this? For the first time in her life, she did not have an answer. A walk in the jungle. Before she could respond, a Seraphim officer approached, giving a formal salute. "Princess, the retrieval ships will arrive within the hour. We must prepare." Varelia gave a brief nod. "Understood." The officer left, and Elias sighed. "Well, looks like we got some time to kill." There was a small, unreadable smile on his face. "How about a walk?" Varelia blinked. "A walk?" Elias shrugged. "We just fought side by side, saved each other's lives, and took down a pirate ship. I figure we deserve a break." Varelia studied him carefully. She should have refused. There was no reason to waste time. And yet, before she could stop herself, she said, "Very well." So they walked. Between two worlds. The jungle was still and quiet now, untouched by war in the deeper areas. Strange blue flowers glowed softly along the path, and small winged creatures flitted between the trees. The air was humid but cool, filled with the scent of damp earth and alien flora. For the first time, there was no battle, no politics, no war. Just them. Elias broke the silence first. "So, what's it like, being royalty?" Varelia glanced at him. "It is a duty. My life is devoted to the Dominion, to leading, to ensuring order." Elias grinned. "Sounds exhausting." Varelia raised an eyebrow. "And being the soldier is not." He chuckled. "Fair point." He kicked a loose stone as they walked. "But at least I get to choose where I go, what battles I fight." Varelia hesitated. "I do not have that luxury." Elias glanced at her. "And if you did?" She did not answer, because she had never considered it. A flustered princess. As they reached a small clearing, Elias stopped. "You know, for someone who acts all cold and serious, you're not as emotionless as you pretend to be." Varelia stiffened. "That is incorrect." Elias smirked. "Oh, so if I said you actually enjoyed fighting with me, you wouldn't deny it?" Varelia crossed her arms. "Enjoyment is irrelevant. We fought well together. That is all." Elias took a slow step closer. "You sure?" For the first time in her life, Princess Varelia, calm, controlled, unreadable, felt flustered. Her heart beat a little faster, her fingers twitched at her sides, and she suddenly found it difficult to meet his gaze. Elias noticed, and grinned. "You are insufferable," she muttered. "And you're terrible at lying." Elias shot back. She exhaled, turning away before he could see the strange warmth on her face. "We should return. The retrieval ships will arrive soon." Elias chuckled, following her. "Sure, princess. Whatever you say." But as they walked back, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Because, for some reason, she didn't mind his company. The retrieval ships had arrived. The Human Federation and the Seraphim Dominion had sent their finest diplomats and officers to Vecris to assess the situation. The battlefield was now filled with soldiers collecting supplies, repairing equipment, and ensuring that no more enemies remained hidden in the jungle. But for Captain Elias Ward, the real battle had already begun. It wasn't against pirates. It wasn't against an alien army. It was something much more dangerous. It was against his own feelings. The distance between them. Elias stood on the loading ramp of his transport ship, arms crossed as he watched Princess Varelia in the distance. She was speaking to her Seraphim advisors, her posture as perfect and controlled as always. But something was different now. Elias could see it in the way she glanced at him, even when she thought he wasn't looking. The way her fingers fidgeted slightly at her sides, something she never did before. The battle they had fought together had changed things between them. They weren't just a soldier and a princess anymore. They were something else. And that was the problem. Because in a few hours, she would board her ship and return to the Dominion, and he would return to the Federation. 2 different worlds, 2 different lives. Elias exhaled. Maybe it was better this way. Maybe he had been foolish to think that a Seraphim princess could ever. Captain. His thoughts vanished as he turned to see Varelia standing in front of him, an unfinished conversation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of soldiers and engines filled the air around them, but it felt like they were in a world of their own. Varelia finally spoke. "We never finished our conversation." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" She narrowed her silver eyes slightly. "You know which one." Elias sighed, leaning back against the metal frame of the ship. "All right, princess. I'll ask again." He looked her directly in the eyes. "What happens next?" Varelia hesitated, and Elias knew why. Because for the first time in her life, she didn't know the answer. "I return to the Dominion," she said finally. "I have a duty to my people." Elias gave a small nod. "Yeah, and I have mine." Another silence. Then, in a quieter voice, Varelia said that I do not wish to leave things unfinished. Elias felt his heartbeat pick up. "What are you saying?" She met his gaze, her face calm. But there was something soft in her expression, something that made his chest feel too tight. "I do not know," she admitted. "But I know this." She stepped closer. Too close. "I trust you, Elias Ward," she said softly. "More than I expected to. More than I should." Elias swallowed. "Varelia." A voice interrupted them. "Princess, the ship is ready for departure." Varelia turned slightly. A Seraphim officer stood at attention, waiting for her command. She looked back at Elias. "I must go." Elias forced a smirk, trying to lighten the heavy feeling in his chest. "Yeah, guess you do." Varelia hesitated, just for a second. Then she did something unexpected, something that made Elias's brain freeze completely. She lifted her hand and placed it lightly on his chest, a small, simple gesture. But for a Seraphim, a species known for their reserved nature, their strict discipline, their control, this was the closest thing to an unspoken confession. Elias didn't breathe. Varelia held his gaze for a moment longer. Then, with quiet finality, she stepped back. "Until we meet again, Captain." And before Elias could find the right words to say, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the waiting ship. A new war begins. The Seraphim transport lifted off, its engines humming as it rose into the sky. Elias stood there, watching it go. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do next, because he had fought in many battles before. But this was the first war he didn't know how to win. The Federation command ship floated in the vast darkness of space, its steel hull reflecting the distant glow of a blue star. Inside, Captain Elias Ward sat alone in his quarters, staring at the holographic screen in front of him. The image of Princess Varelia was displayed on the screen, a recording taken during one of the diplomatic meetings. She looked as calm and controlled as ever, her silver eyes unreadable. But Elias knew the truth now. That calmness wasn't because she lacked emotions. It was because she was hiding them. And now she was gone, back to the Seraphim Dominion, back to her world of duty and tradition. Elias exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair. He had been in countless battles, survived impossible odds, faced enemies far stronger than him. But this feeling of being powerless, was worse than anything. Because for the first time in his life, he wanted something more than just duty. And that terrified him. An unexpected offer. A sharp beep from his communicator pulled him from his thoughts. "Captain Ward, you're needed in the command center." Elias sighed and stood up, back to duty. When he entered the command room, he found Admiral Grayson waiting for him, a stern, gray-haired officer with a presence that demanded respect. "Captain," Grayson said, "we just received a new order from Federation High Command. You're being reassigned." Elias frowned. Reassigned? To where? Grayson tapped on a console, bringing up a holographic star map. A single system was highlighted, the Seraphim Dominion. Elias's heart skipped a beat. "You're sending me back to the Dominion?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Grayson nodded. "The diplomatic talks with the Seraphim have reached a critical stage. They've requested a Federation representative to oversee security during the next phase of negotiations." He paused, then added, "They specifically requested you." Elias blinked. What? The Seraphim had requested him. Or rather, had she requested him? He forced himself to keep his expression neutral. "I assume Command wants me to accept." Grayson smirked. "Let's just say they think you're the best man for the job." Elias hesitated for only a second. Then he nodded. "I'll leave immediately." Reunion in the stars. The journey to the Seraphim capital world was uneventful. Elias spent most of it staring at the endless void of space, trying to ignore the anticipation building inside him. Would she be the same when he saw her again? Or had he imagined the unspoken connection between them? When his ship finally docked at the Dominion's Grand Orbital Station, a group of Seraphim guards awaited him, and at the center of them stood her, Princess Varelia. She was dressed in formal Seraphim robes, her posture as elegant as ever. But when she saw him step off the ship, something flickered in her expression, something soft and unspoken. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with the faintest smile, Varelia said, "Welcome back, Captain." Elias smirked. "Miss me already, Princess?" Her silver eyes gleamed. "You were a necessary choice." Elias chuckled. "Sure, whatever you say." But he knew. He knew. And for the first time in a long, long while, he wasn't just fighting for duty anymore. He was fighting for something more.